My name is Julie Bernard, and I am a retired judge from Massachusetts. I'm CEO of the Flashner Judicial Institute. We do judicial education and training, but I think it's a little bit more than that. I know that this panel is going to talk about the impacts of slavery on justice, sentencing, and society. And everything you've heard today has led us to this discussion. And I know that history, as has been said earlier, is alive. History is collaborative. And it's true, when you open the courthouse doors, as Justice Long said, people come in, they enter, and they bring all of their problems with them. No matter what type of judge you are, you have a responsibility to decide their case in a fair and just manner. If you're a lawyer, you must ensure that you provide fair and adequate treatment to your clients. James Baldwin once said that history is not the past, it's the present, and you carry it with you. We all carry history with us. I know I did as a judge. I know we all do in whatever we do in our work or in our lives. The history and vestiges of slavery are ever present in the courts, sentencing, in society, and we've heard that today, and you will hear that in the panel that you're about to hear right now. I want to thank Dr. Michelle Goodwin for her scholarship, and I'm sure that we're going to make available, I know on the Flashner website, her article talking about slavery, its evolution, and mass incarceration. I want to thank Professor Ramirez and Professor DeBarros-Gomes from Brown and Mr. Kuntz for sharing their time, their stories, their narratives, because that's what this program is all about. When we share, when we collaborate, we learn from each other, and that's what Flashner is about, collaborating, hearing each other's stories, learning, empowering, and I know that once we know and understand history, we are going to elevate and inform our work as judges, as lawyers, just as citizens, and that's what this program is all about, and I hope that when you leave this program, you will continue to elevate the work and the history that you've heard today. Baldwin also said nothing can be changed until it is faced. So I hope by facing our history here today that you take this and elevate, empower, and change and be persistent, as Cheryl Eiffel said earlier today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Ramirez to start this important discussion.
Well, welcome back, everyone. For those of us who haven't lived the golden age, now we know what it's like, right? It is, of course, an honor and a pleasure to be here today. There is no place else I would want to be. I want to begin by asking you to give a round of applause to all the people who, through their hard work and courage, designed and brought us together for this conference. Now, this particular panel is about the illumination of history from other perspectives. First, the power of scholarship, the power that scholars like Michelle Goodwin have, and how she can help us better understand the legal history, the costs and consequences of slavery, and its manifestations today. The power of grassroots activism in the reentry realm. How people in the arena of reentry are trying every day to combat the long-term and historical effects of slavery in the criminal justice system. And I'm particularly grateful for Mr. Kuntz for being with us today, because Thomas's work is in the arena of giving second chances, of taking people who've been entangled in the criminal justice system and liberating them. And in that sense, reentry work, in part, is it's the same journey that Harriet Tubman took. the journey of the Underground Railroad, of freeing people and giving them a new life. And in a very real sense, that's what good reentry work does. It empowers people to begin again, and it liberates them from the carceral state. And of course, the power of art, the power to engage all of our senses with the history and its ramifications. So I am so honored and proud to have our panel here today. I wanted to begin with Professor Goodwin and to ask you about what vestiges of slavery you see today in this modern democracy in daily life.
I too want to join you in thanking the organizers of this convening, those who've presented already today, and those of you who are here. It's so critically important. I think we have to ask ourselves the question about what was slavery, and then that helps us to understand the vestiges today. Slavery is that gut punch that we want to breeze past. We see it depicted in films through people in very bucolic fields. The fields are always very green and verdant. And maybe they're singing, and there's a scarf on some women's heads, and we say, that's slavery. And we say, it's bad, forgive ourselves, that's slavery, let's move on. But I first want us to unpack really what slavery was, because slavery was more than verdant fields. Slavery, we have to understand it as people going to work, meeting friends, mother and daughter, and then being kidnapped, being taken by force, by gun force, then taken to forts, and then being placed on a ship. And then after being placed on that ship, if you survived, and we've seen those images of being packed in those ships like sardines, one on top of the other. And if you've ever been to Ghana or one of the places where you see the forts, it's horrific. They still exist, and you could see what the conditions were before people were then placed in those ships. But understanding then what it means in the United States, more than just a labor that is physical in those verdant fields. Thomas Jefferson, one of our most revered politicians, presidents, founding framer, father, famously wrote to other politicians that he preferred to stock his plantations with girls and women. He said it's overstated looking for men. And he said the reason why he liked that was because they were turning a profit every year or two. So what is Thomas Jefferson thinking about in little girls turning profit every year or two? What is Thomas Jefferson putting these girls up to turn a profit every year or two? What is it in terms of one's capacity to even put that in writing and recommend it to other people? What does that say about our nation? What does that say about the framers, about the founders, that it would be that? And you can find these letters on the Monticello website, if they're still up, many things being taken down from websites. And then we'd have to ask ourselves, then what is it when this is being advertised? Because it's not just Thomas Jefferson saying it to people, but imagine a country wherein there are literally tens of thousands of advertisements that basically say the same thing. Gang of breeding wenches, ages 10 to 12 for sale. Now what makes you a breeding wench? What is that? And what is it when we're so bold and brazen that we put it in an advertisement and we do that such that this is what we wake up to in our morning coffee or tea as we crunch on our toast, that the breeding wenches are being sold off? I mention this because we have to understand truly what slavery was, more than verdant green fields of people picking cotton, but little girls being placed into a labor that is horrendous, into a labor that in any other case we would call sex trafficking, but we don't call it sex trafficking because of the people who were doing it. And that's hard to reconcile for us. It's hard to reconcile. And that it's being put in newspapers. Imagine if we picked up the New York Times today and the Washington Post, and in there, gangs of girls for sale for sex. We'd say, no, shut that down. Let's get law enforcement there. You can't do that. That's terrible. That ignores their dignity, their humanity, their personhood. But then this is another key point. which is that slavery was about making sure that people could not have personhood. I like to ask a question. And this question is, what story does the mother tell her child the night before the slave auction? And it's a question that we don't tease about, right, or think about. But when you think about it, here's a mother or the child that's about to be sold away. Now, somehow that mother must convey a message to this child against what is American law. And what I mean by what is against American law is that somehow that mother must make sure that that child recognizes that it is a human being, that it has worth, value, dignity, because state law says you are not a person. You're no higher than a mule, a goat, a pig, a chicken in the fields. Federal law says the same in the Fugitive Slave Act, the same. You have no value. So how do you survive a generation beyond your mother? Your mother has to tell you some story that makes sure in your heart and your soul that you understand that you are a human being with value. Now on to your question, which is, how does this all live in systems today? Well, even though the 1865 reconstruction of the Constitution, starting with the 13th Amendment, abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. And I tell this story because we have to understand what's the involuntary servitude part. Well, that's the involuntary servitude part, that rape part that's been baked into American law. It has an exception clause. And that exception clause is except if convicted of a crime. After the 1865, after it was drafted by members of Congress, and it's worth recognizing that there were abolitionists in Congress. We don't get a reconstructed Constitution, save for the fact that there were radical Republicans who risked their lives. We have not even told that story, which deserves to be told. The very bold, the very brave white men in Congress who said, I will die for the freedom of other people. I think it's a shame in our nation that we don't recognize them. But in that, before Southern states got to ratifying this, they began passing these laws, making it a crime if you are more than a few people standing on a corner, that it is a crime if you don't look a certain way while walking down the street, that it's a crime depending upon the quality of your home, that it's a crime if you're black and you sell rice, that it's a crime if you're black and you sell corn, that it's a crime if you're black and you engage in contracting. It's a crime if you are black and you own a gun. All of these things which can put you in a legal system, and if you cannot afford to pay what are the fines, which at the time were fines of $75, $100, $150, you all are judges. You know right now that there are people who come before your courts that cannot afford $75. Can you imagine in 1866 that you stood on a corner, two people, you're on a corner. It's illegal in this town for two black people to sit on a corner, stand on a corner. And now here's this fine. Just pay this $100, $150 fine and it'll be okay. This is how we get to a convict leasing system because people can't afford to pay those fines. And there becomes a very perverse incentive in this way to keep that cycle going. We see this taking shape today in many ways. I'm sure we'll come back to it and I'll share more. Thank you so much.
No, that was I'm really glad you took the time to both describe what is slavery, what the system was with narratives and facts, and also to begin to describe how it evolved into what we have today. Very important. So you stopped with convict leasing, but of course the story doesn't end there.
No, it doesn't.
And so I'd like you to finish the story and
Thank
talk
you.
about how it evolved from slavery to convict leasing to our criminal justice system today. And I say that because it's easy to forget that these historical vestiges are at the heart of the criminal justice system that we inhabit today. And if we want to make our criminal justice system fairer and more just, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Is this? stand over here. I'll stand here. And that if we want to make our criminal justice system fairer and more just, we have to first understand how it evolved, and then we have to understand what its current status is and what we can do about it. And I mean we, the people in this room.
Thank you so much for that. So it's a horrific system. Basically, the reconstruction lasts less than 20 years. And we'll have another conference for that. And this takes us into this period of what we understand as Jim Crow in the United States, separate but equal, Plessy v. Ferguson. And there's so much to be said about how we understand law and the limitations with how we've been taught what law is. So everyone in this room, most folks in this room, Plessy v. Ferguson, I say most because not all lawyers, this room is not all lawyers. And we understand that Plessy v. Ferguson ushers in separate but equal, but we don't understand that there's an exception in the law that was, that undergirded Plessy. And that was that if you happen to be a black woman nursing a white child, then you could be in the car with white people. But during this period of Jim Crow, what we see is that slavery, as we understood it then, is over, but it becomes transformed. This convict leasing system, you know, when I write about this and I read about this, there are times in which it's a punch in the gut, and it just really burns the soul, because we forget, for example, the original coal mines. They would collapse all the time, and they would collapse, and almost all of the people inside would be young black teenage boys who had been convicted and then had been leased out by the state to private industries. And so it would be 100 dead because the mine collapsed. A few months later, another 150 dead because the mine collapsed. And all of these boys being leased out in the 1910s, the 1920s, caught in these chain gang systems, and they continue to exist. Currently in the United States, I recently moved to Washington, D.C. to teach at Georgetown. I had been teaching at the University of California at Irvine when I wrote the article that in part has inspired my remarks today. In California, we have these notorious wildfires, and they take place in communities where people are incredibly wealthy. And it's this cycle that takes place. But what most people don't know is that the people who put out those fires happen to be people in California's prisons. And they're not just the men, they're the women too. And I think this really helps to crystallize where we are. The reason why this kind of labor is used is because the trucks can't make it up these hills. So if you're going to be able to make it up these hills, you need people to do it. And so starting late at night, 10, 11 o'clock at night, going until 3, 4 in the morning, they're climbing up these hills with bags on their backs that are about 80, 90 pounds to carry what they need to hike their way on up and then to begin to put out these fires. Women have died, men have died doing this. And the challenge that we face as a nation in this regard is that these individuals who now have been trained to do this, who risk their lives to do it, some who die doing it, when they are released, they can't get jobs as firefighters. You know, it's the box, the check the box. Have you ever been incarcerated? Right now, there are well over 500 private industries that use prison slave labor. And here I'm talking about people who do not get paid, and at most might get paid $1 a day. During the peak of COVID, the people who were first making hand sanitizers, making masks for us, guess where they were? They were incarcerated people in the United States who were not even allowed to use the hand sanitizers, denied the use of the masks. Victoria's Secret, known for the beautiful women coming down the runway, for years used incarcerated labor to make their fine lingerie. Cargill uses people who are incarcerated. There's a whole list of Fortune 100, 500,000 companies that use this labor and then will not hire these individuals after they are released. And that is a kind of duality, if you will, of exploitation. To do that work, to be able to do that work so well, and then be denied the opportunities to actually be employed in those spaces, it is a double tragedy.
And I remember reading in your articles some of the stories about the women who were fighting fires, and I know in Massachusetts the prisoners are making a lot of furniture, furniture that's used in the State House and in the courthouse. But I wanted to bring it back to today, and to the reality of the courthouse that many of you face. So a lot of the defendants coming in to the courthouse are people thinking it's going to be the worst day of their life. They're scared. They're there because there's some trouble or problem in their life that they need addressed, or they're there because they're going to be sentenced. For many of the people walking through the doors, all systems have failed them. The early childhood education system, the educational system, the foster system, the mental health system, the substance use disorder system. Now, they stand at the courthouse door. And the question is, do we just process them? Or do we try to find the underlying problems that brought them to the courthouse and address those problems? So I wanted you to talk about today's system, how it manifests itself from the history of the 13th Amendment, and what judges today can do to make the systems, both the civil and criminal justice system, fairer and more just.
Well, here I think that you can talk a bit more too about systems of diversion. So I think we should keep in mind that for so many people who've been incarcerated in the United States, the vast majority are nonviolent individuals who've committed crimes. So many of those individuals who are nonviolent individuals who've committed crimes, it's been drug-related, and that too has had its racialized disparities. We saw that during the era of crystallized cocaine. People call it the crack mom and the crack baby, and now we know that that was not the case at all. But I think diversion programs, and I'd love for you to talk a bit about the program that you run, because it's also an example of what can take shape that actually helps us in so many ways. So let me add an additional layer to this. As you all know, when we incarcerate individuals, it costs us a lot of money to do so. In the state of California, to incarcerate a juvenile, it costs over $250,000 a year. It costs more to incarcerate individuals than it costs to send them to Princeton, to Brown, to Harvard, to Yale per year. That's the amount of money that we spend when we very well could provide rehabilitation, which would cost so much less, and then allow people pathways to reentry. I want to tell a short story and then seriously invite you to talk about your program. Probably about a decade ago, I joined the board of an organization called Regina's Team. As a professor, I've had the opportunity to work with so many fabulous students who've been research assistants, who've gone on to clerkships, and then have now become professors themselves. Well, this is a story about someone before she became a professor, and it's not really about her. She had come across an article about a woman who wrote about having breast cancer while incarcerated. And it was a fascinating story. This woman had created this organization called Regina's Team, and her name was Sue Ellen Allen. And I said, I want to know about this woman, because she talked about how, and it was a nonviolent crime, she talked about on the day in which she was going to get her mastectomy, how she was put in a holding room where there were mice and rats and roaches and things like that before her surgery, how she was shackled and chained down while she was getting her breast cut off, as if she was going to get up and flee someplace, with armed guards in the room, no one allowed to be with her. And then how she then returned to jail, returned to prison, and while there, being denied the medical assistance that she was constitutionally entitled to. And it was the women who were incarcerated around her who said, we're going to help you and help save your life. they knew that she needed a pillow and was supposed to get a pillow so that she wouldn't have muscle atrophy. So they made a pillow for her, and they thought she was fancy, so they made little fringe on it. They did this with sanitary napkins, by the way, because she was denied this. But I wondered, why did she call this organization, this reentry organization, Gina's Team? Well, Gina had been her 25-year-old cellmate. And Gina was about 3 months before being let out. And Gina had been complaining about having severe headaches. When she chewed, that it felt like knives being stabbed into her gums, all these different things. And this was in Arizona. And when the women complained, they were threatened with solitary confinement. Now, if any of you have spent time with judges from Arizona, then you might know that in Arizona, one of the ways in which they do solitary confinement with women is that they put them in a cage and put them out in the heat, where there are women who have literally died being, just baked to death. And so these women were very afraid about this. And somehow Sue Ellen was able to get out a message to Gina's parents somehow. And they called, and Gina's temperature was finally taken because they'd refused to do that. And on that day, Gina lapsed into a coma, and she died 3 days later. When Sue Ellen got out, she created this organization called Gina's Team, named for Gina. But in serving on that board, I learned another layer beyond the academic, just in terms of what our justice systems look like and what we put people through. And what we put people through beyond what is dignified, beyond what is purposeful in our justice system. And we make it very, very difficult for them to re-enter society with dignity. We have so many hurdles and barriers to that, and we need to dismantle what those barriers are. There is slavery in America's prisons that is permitted by our Constitution. There are states that have now removed this from their constitutions, but even if we get past that, we have significant barriers for people, just like Jim Crow, with people coming out and being able to have meaningful lives. And I think this says then a lot about the work that you do.
Well, thank you. I don't have any program that I run. I am the academic advisor. I'm a professor of law at Northeastern Law School, and I'm the academic advisor to the community justice support centers, which are part of our state court system. So the state courts run them, and with the support of Chief Justice Kim Budd and others, we were able to get the legislature to give us $33 million a year, every year, in order to provide reentry resources to every person coming out of prison and jail, whether they came out statewide, federal, or whether they came out 10 years ago or 10 minutes ago. And it is this system that the court runs, which has been really significant. So in terms of diverting people, last year the community justice support systems diverted 749 people in a single year from prison or jail to getting programs and resources at the community justice support centers. The centers served over 3,500 people. It has two components. One is a court-ordered program where judges can order people into the centers instead of prison or jail, and one for people who have come out and are voluntarily going back to the centers for programs. Now, the legislature told us, this resounds to me from the history of what's expected of people, right? Because disproportionately, the people in prison are Black and Latinx. Mm-hmm. And the legislature told us no one will go voluntarily to a reentry center controlled by the courts. Well, today, half of that 3,500 are people voluntarily walking in to get jobs, to get training, and to get the resources they need to move on with their lives. So I think this is work that needs to be done. And with that, we have someone who has spent his life doing reentry work, and doing it in an extraordinary way. And I wanted to learn more about what you, as a formerly incarcerated person, experienced, what you can tell judges about your experience and insights and flaws of our criminal justice system from behind the walls.
So good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I think I'm on. I'm Mike. You can hear me, right? So I'm still coming down. Let me just say this. I got to put a disclaimer. I'm still reeling that I had lunch with some of the top minority justices in the state of Massachusetts, and I'm so honored to have had. So, still trying to come down from that. How you doing? My name is Thomas Kuntz. I'm the Director of Violence Prevention for the Center for Teen Empowerment, where we're helping young men that are transitioning from the prison system. They can be transitioning from gang involvement in the street, or just from diversion programs, helping them to come into Center for Teen Empowerment. They're meeting with mentors, people who have done time like myself. I did 30 years in prison, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Can I get to your question? Because I don't want to divert from your question. Because I don't want.
You're doing fine.
Okay. So we help these young men transition in with GEDs if they don't have GEDs coming home. We help them to get handyman skills where they can come in, they can do a little bit of light plumbing, they can do some painting, just preparing them to have some skills to be hired should they get the opportunity to do some maintenance. We also do restorative justice programming. So we'll bring them in. A lot of times we want to deal with sending them off to school and getting them jobs. That's great. But a lot of times we don't deal with the trauma which brought them to prison in the first place. So I've had the privilege while I was incarcerated to work with young men for 27 years behind the wall. They were bringing in DYS kids, so we sat in circles, didn't even know I was doing restorative justice work there, and just really telling them about our life stories. It was called Second Thoughts. We were giving them second thoughts about the choices they were making. We were not telling them what to do. We was only showing them what happens when you make those decisions. So probably in 2010, a riot happened, or a semi-riot at MCI Norfolk. A young person almost lost his life. There were a lot of young folks that were coming down from the prison system. And we brought a proposal to the superintendent to do restorative justice work. As soon as I saw that proposal, I was, because I didn't know what restorative justice was, right? Accountability, restoration. Again, people think restorative justice is soft on crime, but it's far from that. But it's also dealing with the traumas and some of the things that cause the harm. And it brings all the parties that have been impacted by that harm together to talk about it, to figure out what's the best solution for that, right? So I had a chance to do that. We sat down, we planned bringing this to the superintendent. We brought the proposal. He said, listen, I'm going to give you a year. It doesn't happen. It was totally an act of God as far as I'm concerned. He said, we're going to give you a year to do this restorative justice program. We actually held our first retreat in 2012 at MCI Norfolk. We brought in prosecutors, we brought in judges, we brought in the community, survivors, victims. It was amazing, right? We had prosecutors that wouldn't shake our hand when they came in the room, and by the time they left, they were giving us hugs. I mean, really, it just transformed. There's a power that happens when we can come into a circle. There's no big hats, there's no big eyes, little U's, whatever the case. We are all taking off our hats, and we just become participants, right? So again, from that experience, I had the opportunity to learn restorative justice, to work with probably thousands of young men between the Second Thoughts program, restorative justice behind the wall. I'd walk with young gang members. It was such a privilege to walk with a gang member that said, I've been molested by my uncle, by my dad since the age of such and such, and I've never told anybody about that, and watched them just cry and watch them just be able to release and come into circles. We had prosecutors, we had justices coming in behind the prison walls saying, I've never had the opportunity to share that I had been raped, one prosecutor. I can't even do that with my colleagues on the street, or everybody will be talking about that in the office. But I feel safe enough to come behind the wall to be able to talk with you all because I know it will stay here. So that was the power of restorative justice for me. The work that I did behind prison walls, I got my college degree because I found out, listen, I walked into Walpole 1992 into the middle of a riot. My cousins were like, you sit at this table, you rep this table. If we have to go out and fight, you're going to fight with us. And I'm just like, I don't know if that's going to happen. But, and that's the mentality that I actually took on for a little bit. But I realized earlier, and I know I'm a little bit all over the place, but I'm just making a point. I realized earlier in that sentence coming into Walpole, when Walpole was really Walpole, that was not me. I actually wanted to go to college before I got caught up in my situation that brought me to prison. And one night out with the wrong crowd literally caused me a lifetime of pain, cost my victim his life, and cost his family some harm and my family harm. And that's the beauty of restorative justice. But coming into the prison system, knowing that I was faced with, I got to roll with the crowd or am I going to go against the system, I decided to go ahead and get my education. They had opportunities where I could go to college. I ended up going to Massasoit when I got in there. I ended up doing some college classes, started taking the program and going against the grain. And it's not always good to go against the grain when you're in an institution where everybody's doing wrong, because you're looked at as the square, you're looked at as corny, you're not the guy, we don't want to hang with you, but that's okay. So when I got to Norfolk, there were so many great things to do and great things to get involved with, and that's how I got into some of the things that I got involved with at Norfolk. I say that to say this. All of that allowed me to get my degree. It allowed me to do some things that literally led to me being released from prison. So in 2019, I went for 6 appeals. you name it, I went for it, right? So I felt like, it was really one of those things where I needed to keep pursuing until my lawyer said, I think you should go for a commutation in the state of Massachusetts, mind you, right? She said, I think it's a good time to go for the commutation. And I'm like, listen, there hasn't been a commutation at that time in 25 years in that state. She's like, I think you have a good case. Charlie Baker was talking about he wanted somebody who was in the service. I was in the Marine Corps when I committed my crime. One night out with the wrong crowd, fired my gun, shot, and killed a young man, and ended up with a natural life sentence. She said, I think you have a good chance on going. Patty Guerin, one of the greatest attorneys in Boston as far as I'm concerned.
And a graduate of Northeastern.
Okay, yes, absolutely. And I'm like, Patty, listen, let's do another motion for new trial. Let's do anything but, that, because it just wasn't working. So Charlie Baker said, okay, I want to do that, and I want to make sure they have college education. I want to make everything kind of fit. So I'm like, okay, let's roll with this. So we actually ended up putting the petition in. Charlie Baker, took a year to vet my case. I went to the Advisory Board of Pardons. I sat in a hearing for about 5 hours, and where they wanted to know, listen, you kill somebody. What do you think the family would be thinking about? You keep fighting this case, and they can't get the rest. Those are tough questions that, to have to answer. Because again, I caused the death of a young man that I'm so remorseful for, and I continually pay back, every day of my life to, be able to make amends. I can't bring the life back, but hopefully I can keep somebody else from taking a life. So that's really been my goal. So we ended up going for that commutation hearing. Governor Baker actually, he moved on that with me and another gentleman named William Allen. And I actually got a commutation in 2022. It was the first in 25 years, and I was so grateful, so honored to be able to get a second chance at life and come out here and make a difference with other young men's lives. So one of the things I was so successful with is because of the work that I did behind the walls. So my message tends to be, because I go into the same prison that I came home from now. I go into Norfolk. My encouraging message to them is, listen, the work starts here. You can't sit here doing nothing and spinning wheels and expect to figure out what brought you to prison. Get into those programs, get into emotional awareness. I'm an encouragement. I was doing a natural life sentence. I was not supposed to be sitting here before you today, but for the grace of God, I was doing the right thing and trying to better my life behind prison walls, and a door opened for me, and I was able to go through it because of that work. So that's my message going in. I go into DYS. I meet with the young folks. I have the opportunity to meet with them even before they come home and tell them about the work we do at the Center for Teen Empowerment, and also tell them about the time that I did and encourage them that you really don't want to go upstate because, listen, what your little boys are telling you up there, like it's a good time and come on up here or whatever, that's really not the story. They're not telling you when they're crying at night. They're not telling you about how they're fighting to get home from those life bids that they, picked up in the street. They're not telling you the real deal about the gangs and all these things that you're going to have to face coming up here. So again, that's a privilege. I go into South Bay, I get a chance to talk to the guys at the House of Correction, and when they're coming home, I get to prepare them for just really from the inside and coming home to be able to transition them. So we offer, clothing, we offer a phone if they need a phone, we offer that, to get them into college, you name it, we'll try to make it happen. We have partners out here, but we don't have enough opportunity to be funded for those opportunities. So there are some grants out there. I was just talking with Deborah about the fact that we're trying to work with the courts, we're trying to work with the DAs right now, and most of the time they want to utilize our program. We want to send our young men over there. We want to do diversion programs, but when we say, hey, it costs money to send your young people over here, they're like, oh, the courts don't have money, the DA's office doesn't have money, and it becomes like, about like, how do we sustain, our program if we don't have the funding? And I can't begin to tell you the importance of diversion program. I can't begin to tell you the importance of me having mentors. I have 4 mentors that have done time, and so these young people can't say you can't relate to me. You can't tell me I can't relate to you, and I've done 30 years in prison and came back home and bounced back and have my own car and have my own apartment and I'm doing well out here. I do that to encourage you that you can do the right thing too. So again, I think funding, we talked about this earlier. Funding is a major issue, with the courts and with the diversion programs. We also talked about earlier, Judge Hom. I wish Judge Hom was still here. So Judge Hom happens to be my hero, and she's probably the reason why I'm here today. Let me see if I can pin this on real quick. She tends to be my hero, and she recommends me for every speaking engagement that's coming up. But that's another story. I met Judge Hom coming home. Judge Hom had me on a 40-person Zoom with Black and brown justices. And I had a chance to talk with them about my reentry, about what's successful, what's not. And the one question that sticks with me, and I even shared it at lunch, is they asked me, I forgot who it was that asked me, is what would you want us to know about a young man coming before us? What do we need to know about a defendant coming before us? And I said, what you really need to know about a defendant coming before you is that the defendant, first of all, is a real person. He's not a caseload, he's not a number, he has a story. And sometimes we're just looking at these young men that are coming before us, and we're just kind of like, okay, give me the caseload, tell me a little bit about them, but we're not looking at the trauma, the impact that caused them possibly to be able to commit those crimes that they're doing. And we're not condoning crime, and we're not, justifying any actions. If we do the time, if we do the crime, do the time. But what we don't realize is that there's some traumas that have been done to us that have impacted the direction we've taken, or maybe even where we've landed. And it doesn't mean that you excuse the crime, but it means you take that into consideration, that this man has had some harms, he's traumatized, and how do we make this, a fair system, or a fair system of justice for him, and taking that into recognition, I guess is what I could say. So that was the thing that I said, that's why we do restorative justice, right? Restorative justice brings, sometimes the victims don't want the person to do the time. They just want to know, why did you go out and do that and bring harm to me? Why did you just steal my car? Why did you rob? They just want answers. And sometimes the system doesn't give them answers because it's just going through a process, right? When you're bringing in that person that gets a chance to talk about the impact on the community that I had, I literally shot a young man, and he was on the street laying there dying. The community said, we can't even sleep at night. You know what I'm saying? Because of what has happened. I had to read all that through the paper. This young man was a twin. And this mother said in an article, she said, every time I see his other twin, I have to think about him. I have to think about him on every birthday that goes by because his twin has a birthday. You think that didn't impact me after I grew up and realized the harms that I caused and was doing those programs in restorative justice and emotional awareness and really coming into understanding the harm that I caused? So everybody behind prison walls is not sitting there playing games, not doing those things. There's some men that's doing some real work behind the prison walls, and they can be utilized on the outside as mentors to be able to help these other young people to be, with an option for the courts instead of sentencing them and just, putting them back where they're probably not going to get the work or the opportunities that I had. I say this to say all that. Judge Hom left. Judge Hom called me 2 years ago when I came home, and I'm going to wrap this up. I'm so sorry.
No. You're doing great.
Judge Hom called me, and I say she's my hero because she said, I have a young man here. The prosecutor wants a year. I think this young man is really making some progress. He's making some growth. I've got some good reports from his attorney. I'd like to be able to give him an alternative to, sending him up to the county. I said, absolutely. I will go pick him up if you will allow him to be released, and you can put him into my hand. I was just coming home. I was just transitioning myself, but that was really just the passion that I had to say, don't put him in there. We can do more with him through the Center for Teen Empowerment. She actually sent this young man over. This man, he was a tough one too. Listen, yeah, so anyway. So I had to, Anyway, so yeah, so he was a tough one and you know, kind of resisted a little bit. But when he came to see that we really cared about him and the compassion, because a lot of these young men, they really want to just see if you're going to give up. So they'll keep pushing you to the edge. And you know, I was just not giving up on him. About a year after he was in the program, he really stopped fighting it. He started realizing that we were there to support him. He actually now works for one of the, what's the underground where they do all the, I forgot the name of it, they do the pipes and stuff under the ground and so forth. He's doing well. He's making probably about a good $60,000 a year, has a family, has his kids. And again, that's the success story, right? He could have went to the House of Correction, but he came, he got some transitional, his transitional needs met, he went into restorative justice, and he got healed from some of that trauma. I will stop with that because I've said way too much. Thank you, Deborah.
And so I think that that's the power of second chances and the power that every judge has to take a chance on someone and to use the reentry system. As I said, we in Massachusetts are fortunate because Justice Kim Budd and the court leadership have gone to the legislature every year to get money because that goes to your funding issue. Other states might be able to convince their legislatures to create a comprehensive statewide, state-funded reentry network. So our next panelist is going to tell us about the power of art and the power of art to engage all of our senses. Now, did you want to do your slide thing first?
Yeah, I'm not as good as my colleagues. I need
Oh,
props
this is
to
not
be able
true.
to get through, to stick to my points.
But before you do that, some of the art that she has is here, and I'm going to pass it around. Now, if you have like really good clothes, you might be careful about handling some of this. Do you want to give them a warning?
Yes, so I have, and I can actually grab from my bag, I brought little face cloths. I'm going to be talking a little bit, I feel like it's the corporate capitalist parallel to what you were talking about with the shift in systems. But I have ruined many an outfit dealing with these things, so I'm gonna,
You want to tell us about what we're passing around?
Yes. So here, if you want to wipe your hands because they are very rusty, and I don't want anyone's outfits to get ruined. I don't have one for you, Kimberly, sorry. And I should grab the clicker, maybe, so I can, okay, let me see if this works. Yes. So what you are looking at are some historic cuffs, leg irons, what are called bilbos. There are some modern handcuffs going around. And it is all the result of a friendship I made with a very kind older gentleman. We happened to be leaving the same place at the same time and struck up a conversation. And he asked me if I wanted some books. He was downsizing and he wanted to give me some books. And I said, sure. So he's older, he has Parkinson's, so he would only have a box like this size every time he came to see me with the books. And about 3 months into the friendship, very casually, he said, you know, I'm a blacksmith. I was like, okay. He said, yeah, I made all of the shackles and cuffs for the movie Roots. And I said, okay, you probably should have led this friendship with that. He said, oh yeah, and you know, I also did the stuff for Amistad and 12 Years a Slave and Underground Railroad. And I want to say maybe 2 years ago, his Parkinson's was progressing and he needed to move into a smaller place. And so he actually gave me all of his work that he had done for movies and the historical chains and shackles he had collected over 40, 50, 60 years, right, to perfect his work. So, and they were all in buckets. They were just in random buckets. So I would, on Mondays, go to his house, and we would sit through, and I would hold something up, and he'd say, oh, that's from Underground Railroad, or oh, that's a historic. You know, you wouldn't believe how many people actually have these in their barns down south, just have them. And so that's him there. His name is Bill Shear. I got a little bit of blacksmith training. And part of what I learned in working with him, other than how the locks work, how the shackles were made, he talked to me a lot about the Hyatt Company. The Hyatt Company was established, I think, around 1780, 81, 82. And they provided most of the leg irons, the bilbos. And so I'm using the word bilbo, assuming everyone knows what that means. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Can you hold up? Yeah. So that's a bilbo. You would put your feet through. You would have your feet put through, right? And then sit in a crouched position, and you wouldn't be able to move your feet or stand up. So those were used on slave ships. Those were also used for punishment. Shackles, leg irons, bilbos, these were all produced by the Hyatt Company for the transatlantic slave trade, and they made a fortune. When slavery became abolished, particularly in British colonies, because the Hyatt Company was in Birmingham, UK, they very quickly pivoted to producing handcuffs for police and handcuffs for militaries. And so this transition, right, and they would actively promote, so during the convict leasing system or in Jamaica, when formerly enslaved people refused to go back and work on plantations, they would be arrested and forced to go back and work on plantations. And so the Hyatt Company would then provide shackles and handcuffs for that. They no longer exist. They were bought out by another company. Called Safariland. Safariland currently makes handcuffs, shackles, leg irons for police, prisons, militaries, but they are somehow promoting the nostalgia of the Hyatt Company. So they will still have, and I don't know if you're able to see that text, but they will still imprint on the metal, Hyatt Company. And the Hyatt handcuffed brand reemerges with its legacy of quality restraints. And I can't help but wonder what they are trying to connote by calling their company Safari Land, right? And so again, I just think it's this parallel. It's all the same system.
Right? I mean, because the very badges that police officers wear now were the first were. Right. Slaveholder badges, right? It's the exact same copies that you could see, old system, new system.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I wanted you to share with us some of your background, training, and experience. Because you've worked with artists as a curator, as a historian, as an anthropologist, and also what brought you to focus on this particular work?
I'll go back to, again, the needing props to stay on track. So this is sort of the cycle of work that I've been involved in and the people that I've encountered that have shaped my perspectives on how I talk about freedom, how I think about slavery, how I think about my own connections, right, within this system. So up there in the top, 1978, that's me here. Not at one of Newport's wonderful beaches, but off of one of the piers by the bridge, because that's where people of color in this city learned how to swim and were able to go and swim and have leisure on the waterfront. It wasn't like written in law that we didn't go to the beaches, but we didn't go to the beaches, right? We went to the piers. So that's me at about 3 years old, learning to swim off of that pier. I got my professional start as an archaeologist on the Mashantucket Pequot Reservation, which was really instrumental to how I developed as an anthropologist, archaeologist, historian, because I was doing histories that were not my own. And I had to learn to give the community members I was working with authority to tell their own stories and from their own perspectives. As I was doing that work as a grad student, I took an opportunity to go to the West Indies and do archaeology on a former plantation. So on the island of St. Croix, which is in the US Virgin Islands, there are rather than like towns, they're called estates. And all of those estates are former plantations that still have the names of the plantation owners. So I was there doing that archaeology because there was a development that was going to go up, and they wanted to know what to do with the slave village that was still pretty much intact and the cemetery that was still pretty much intact. My suggestion was to keep it there and leave it alone. So I'm not sure what happened there, but while I was there, I wanted to make sure the work that I was doing was okay with the community. And I started to go to like community meetings, community gatherings, town hall meetings, and a lot of the leadership in the community were people who were very much targeted by the police, the Rastafarian community on the island. And so I asked my PhD advisor if I could take off archaeologist hat and put on anthropologist hat and go and live in that community. And so for about 10 years on and off, I lived with that community to understand their perspectives on colonialism, and particularly United States colonialism. I will say the man that is in that picture with me on the bottom left passed away shortly after his son was murdered by police. And I feel, even though they were not convicted of murder, I feel confident saying it was murder because his son was shot in the back of the head while he was laying on the ground. And he passed away shortly after that. From there, I went to West Africa and lived there for a little while and really became embedded in African worldviews, African spirituality. It's been a 15-year relationship with the community in Porto Novo, or I can't get away from Newports, right? Newport, Benin, where I learned about the history of the slave trade from that perspective, and also the connections between places like Newport and West Africa. And as the Rastas in that community in St. Croix tell me, even to this day, I would not be able to do the work that I do unless I took that path, because they call it a reverse seasoning. So if you think about enslaved people that were brought here to New England, most of them came from the West Indies, right? They were seasoned in the West Indies before they were sent here. I was seasoned in the West Indies before I went back home, right, to West Africa. And now I'm here, right? I'm back here. And I was saying earlier to a few people, I actually took classes in this room as an undergraduate. This is the very room where I read 100 Years of Solitude in Spanish, right? So full, and that's why it's a circle, right? Really full circle. But I mention all of that in that path, which is very indirect, right? I don't think I would be able to do what I do or have the perspective I have unless I went through all of that. And in about 3 weeks, I'm heading back to Porto Novo, Benin for more community work and celebration.
And is there anywhere we can see your art?
So I don't produce art. I curate it. Currently, a little bit away from the downtown area, I have an exhibit where I worked with lots of local artists on an exhibition called Forging Freedom, because we wanted to make a statement that freedom is not a point in time, that freedom is an ongoing process that moves you away from dystopia toward utopia, and it's constant work. And so when we look at the history of slavery, when we look at our history, right, as people of color, emancipation wasn't freedom. Manumissions weren't freedom because you were still dealing with the same old oppressions. And so really looking at the work that people do every day that we can call freedom making. And that exhibition, which is full of wonderful art, and I might have some images here, is also any pieces that sell. So these are two pieces that are there. This is by Providence artist Jasmine Lee Johnson. It's called Flea Plantation. This one here is called Rescue the Perishing, Mami Wata, by a Newport artist here. Any of these pieces that sell in the gallery, the gallery owner has forfeited her commission so that the money can come to the Center for Black History, where I'm director. But again, just thinking about those perspectives, how did we envision freedom, right? how do we envision freedom? And so this Mami Wata story, which I'm probably running out of time, but I love to share as a story. Share it?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things, one of the stories I love to tell as a person that is so embedded in West African spirituality are stories of Mami Wata. And Mami Wata is an entity, an energy, a vibration, whatever you want to call her, beneath the ocean, which is seen as divine feminine space. And if you picture time as a circle rather than a line, as sub-Saharan Africans do, everything has a birth, life, a death, and a rebirth. And so Mami Wata's stories are based in that framing of time and that worldview. And so in that context, when you think about enslaved people that jumped overboard or were thrown overboard, it's often framed as a suicide, but in an African worldview, it's a rebirth. It's like a baptism, right? You're going back to the water, you're going back to your ancestors. And so for me, as opposed to talking about jumping overboard as a suicide, I frame that as a freedom making as well. And so this quilt has Mami Wata waiting, right, to rescue the perished and make sure that they get back to their ancestors.
Beautiful story and a wonderful way to end the panel. Did you have something you wanted to say?
I did, and the image that you showed with you, if you could go back to that, and you said that there was no law as to why we were there and not someplace else. I think it helps to bring, no, it was the first one, you showed yourself in the water.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, because it actually brings something to mind, which I think brings all of this back, which is that all of the very laws that we didn't know existed, but that did in fact exist, that kept you off the beach. Literally thousands of laws that were passed after Reconstruction that would get us back to slavery, that would be an excuse to confine us. I mean, we live within the framework of, there was Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was denied a seat, and that's what Jim Crow is. And that's the American version. And that is not what Jim Crow is. Unfortunately, we have what's left from Pauli Murray and her treatise, Race Laws in America. Nearly 800 pages, single space, that show us state by state, when no, you can't actually legally go to the beach. No, that legally if you are black, you may not go to the park. That if you are black, no, you may not swim in the pool. We know that the Supreme Court dealt with a case just like that out of Mississippi, where black people were denied being able to go into the parks and the ability to be able to go into the swimming pools. And that is then this horrible reality that's so much and so thick that we don't even bother to really know and really contend with.
Thank you. Great way to end our panel.
Can I just so that it doesn't end on a gloom and doom note with the shackles that I'm passing around? So I didn't have time to talk about this earlier, but one of the things that I would love everyone to keep in mind as those shackles are being passed around, although I said I didn't want it to end on a gloom and doom note, one of the sort of added bitter legacies that happened with those shackles is that iron is probably one of the most sacred materials for West Africans. Forging iron is the only way it's envisioned that a man can come even close to creating life as a woman does. You're taking red iron ore, which is the blood of the earth, and you're fashioning it into something important and sacred. So imagine having that worldview or perspective, and that's the very thing that's used to chain you in slavery, right? The material that you use to speak to your ancestors or to celebrate or to pray. And so I just want you to think about the power of iron and how sacred it is to people of African descent as you're getting rusty and ruining your outfits with the...
But I think that there is a high note, which is actually breaking those chains.
Yeah.
I mean, to think of all of us in this room and us on this panel here is also a sign of breaking those chains.
Yeah, thank you for that.
We have time for questions. We have 7 minutes, correct?
Oh.
You have people here who are actively fighting for freedom, actively breaking chains. And if you have any questions, now is the time. Does anyone have questions? Yes.
Hello, hi. Hello. Okay, my name is Rose, and I work at an organization called Rhode Island for Community and Justice. Thank you so much for everything that you have shared. But my question was mostly for Thomas, because you talk about the restorative justice work that you are doing with at RICJ. We do a lot of that work, and you said a comment that was really funny, but you didn't give the answer to. Is that a lot of people say that restorative justice is like an easy, like, oh, it's just. I get a lot of that, especially with the work that I do with young people, that it's not serious enough, and trying to get the buy-ins of police department and the court to work alongside the work that we're doing gets to be challenging here in Rhode Island. So I really wanted to ask, what are the biggest challenges that you've encountered in doing that work, and then what advice do you have for organizations that want to deepen that work, especially here in our state, and with young people specifically, because I work with high schoolers? So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I am still on. That's a good question. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is really people that are trying to talk about something that they don't know, whether it's soft on crime or whatever. Until you have done a restorative justice circle, you will never know the power or the impact that it will have upon everybody in the circle, and that it does impact everybody in the circle, including the responsible parties. Me coming into a circle, hearing a survivor talk about, so in my case, we were in a car being chased. I fired a shot. It ended up hitting a young man in the chest, ricocheted off his sternum, and it pierced his heart. He bled to death. I never saw the gentleman. I know that I ended up shooting somebody because they said, I think you shot someone. But I got a chance to hear from his family about some of the things that happened the night of the incident. So they talked about when the shot was fired, someone went to his house, got his mother and father, told him that Mark had been shot. They all came outside. They fell to their knees. They ended up going over to the hospital. All his friends were there. They were, crying. They were, doing all kinds of, they were just distraught. She said the doctor came out. She took one look at the doctor, and she said, I knew my son was gone. So that impact and that information that I got was the only thing that I knew about the situation. But when I came into a restorative justice circle, and now we have survivors, and we have mothers that their sons have been shot or harmed by some of the same things that we did, it really brings things home. Because again, now I'm hearing firsthand what has happened and what were some of the harms that possibly I could have caused even to my victim. So the power in coming into the circle is so much bigger than you hearing about restorative justice. You can't read a pamphlet on restorative justice or do a weekend seminar and think you know restorative justice. It just doesn't work like that. Restorative justice is a lifestyle. I actually have my LLC, Tech Transformative Solutions, where I'm teaching corrections officers and justices and courts how to implement that in their systems, and you have to be in the process. So that's what I would say, is get in the process, because you may think you're coming in there just to kind of learn about restorative, but there's some traumas that you may have deep down inside, whether it be injustices that happen to you, whether it be some harms you've caused, and it's going to impact you in such a way that you have to see it in person. So if I could say that, I hope that answered your question.
And I think there was a second part of your question too. Right. Any other questions? All right, I want to thank our panelists. This was
If I may, before I go, so Justice Gantz used to come up to restorative justice, and I know that's your husband, And I just want to really give honor. Justice Gantz was impacted so much by coming up and doing restorative justice that he went back to the bench and changed his whole way of doing justice. And, you know, that's another addition to the power of restorative. So thank you. Your husband did a great job. We were so proud of him. And it's great to meet you. And
Those of you who don't know this, my husband was Ralph Gantz. He died 5 years ago. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court. And we have named part of our reentry program, the court's reentry program, the Community Justice Support Center program, the Ralph Gantz Reentry Program. That's the voluntary part that we do. And so part of his legacy is to unchain, to fight for freedom, and to understand his mandate to the judges in Massachusetts was this: do not merely process the people who are coming before you. Look hard at them. Find out the underlying problem that brought them into the courthouse, and use these new Community Justice Support Center resources to address those underlying problems of poverty, of trauma, of substance use disorder, of mental illness, of homelessness, right? And so through the Community Justice Support Centers, his work continues. That's right.